this week's rock star is Brett Davis with You're So Vain. So Brett currently operates a global structural geology consultancy called Alinda Gold out of Central Queensland, Australia. Thank you so much, Brett, for getting involved and coming on. So yeah, we're all really excited to hear from you. So thank you.
Right, okay, before I share my screen, thanks very much, Jess. A spectacularly good series, especially considering you told me you're not a geologist. And thank you for bringing Daniel on, because it now means that my jokes won't be quite so bad compared to his. So
I hope he's still here.
As a bit of an aside, this presentation, it's one of those things where it's a very large topic, so I've just extracted a couple of things from it. And it was a bit of a lead on from COVID-induced isolation last year, where I started putting a few posts on the internet on LinkedIn regarding veins, and they got a fair bit of feedback. And ultimately, I did 7 posts, and I put all that together as a small document. It's about 100 pages full of high-quality vein photos, which I've turned into a PDF. So if any of the people on this this show, we'll call it a dog and pony show, interested in that document, just get a hold of me later or via Jess, and we can organise to send that out to you guys. And it just goes through the roles of veins in a deforming rock mass as fluid carriers, fluid barriers, zones of movement accommodation, zones of volume accommodation when we create space and so forth. So that's a bit of an addendum to some of the stuff I'll go through today. I will just start now, and hopefully you guys will enjoy what I'm going to go through. It's a little bit of stuff on technique and a little bit of stuff on some of the complications with vein system analysis. And without further ado, let's get into it. I do realise that I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, people like Steve Micklethwaite, who have done fantastic presentations historically. So this one is no attempt to be a very highbrow thing. What it is looking at some of the practicalities of how we deal with epigenetic deposits that have veins in them, and from a practical sense, because the majority of geologists out there are the guys at the coalface. They're the guys that are looking at the core, they're the guys mapping underground, they're the guys out tramping around in the field. And hopefully a few of the things that I show today will be actually useful in their work. So the topic, You're So Vain, I didn't expect the song as an intro, but thank you very much, Jess. That was lovely. So a few generalities. Some of the things I'll say during this talk, there's going to be argument backwards and forwards about a couple of them, and that's geology. And the best thing is that these sort of things sponsor discussion. But for the moment, I'll just go with some generalisations, and you can throw the soggy vegetables at the end of the talk, or at least, ask some questions. So firstly, veins, they're fracture infill, basically, and we're depositing minerals from fluids. These fluids are diffusing or flowing through the rock mass in whatever way they can. Lower down in the crust, we're looking at grain scale diffusion. Higher up, where we can open up and promote fluid pathways, we're looking at faults and shear zones and so forth. The veins can be monomineralic, or you can have more than one mineral species, and commonly there's a zoning to them, but that zoning can sometimes be asymmetric, and there's a few tricks in how we address that, which I'll go through a bit later on. And also in tandem with that, as we get alteration assemblages in the wall rocks against the veins, and they can be quite variable in their development. Now, up in the top part of the crust, where we're looking at the epithermal deposits, the high sulfidation, low sulfidation deposits, the veins around porphyries and so forth, it's a bit easier to keep those fractures open, and we can get bigger volumes of veins going in, and we can do it easier. Whereas as we go further down in the crust, we've got to look for catastrophic failure of some of the bigger structures, or we've got to look for slower diffusions through there. And throughout this talk, I will shamelessly name drop just to impress people, and I'll mention people like Steve Micklethwaite and Steve Cox, who've done a lot of work in these areas with how seismic arrays and veins and fluids move through the crust. So if you guys want a little bit more of enhancement on this sort of stuff, go and check out some of their papers. There's some fabulous stuff in it. Vein system analysis, it's a sexy sounding thing, or at least I think it is. But the buzzword at the moment in the exploration industry as particularly is mineral system analysis. And that's a real critical component in finding, you know, our next big deposit, or the next small deposit then turns into a big deposit. Vein system analysis is not the same thing. It's part of the process that we do once we get to the exploration and exploitation stage of the deposit. And what we're doing is we're moving on from that very important process of mineral system analysis, where the really smart people, you know, they've got brains from other planets like John Horonsky and Cam McQuaig and so forth. These guys put together these analyses which allow us to zero in on where we might find a deposit. But once we get to that point, we're starting to develop into it, we're starting to drill into it, we have to understand it. And we're trying to work out the fluid mineralisation budget of the deposit, the age of the mineralisation within the geological history, so not just its structural age, and orientation constraints on that. Because we've got too many people nowadays, I believe, sitting in basements or sitting in offices spinning around 3D models without orientation constraints to how those ore bodies are fitting together. But if you do some of this stuff, some of the vein system analysis, you will start getting some of the orientations to the things which are contributing to your mineralisation. And the other thing is, we're not just looking at the mineralised vein sets, we're also looking at ones that might be impacting on ground conditions. So we may have vein system arrays that are associated with particular faults, and those faults may be impacting on the ground conditions in our development. So there's far too many things to cover in this topic. So what I'll do is I'll just go through the fundamentals of how you start a vein system analysis, and then I'll go through some of the complications that can arise when we're trying to interpret some of these vein textures. So I could go through and discuss things like dilational jogs. I could discuss things like seismicity and how it's related to fluid flow through the crust. I could discuss stockworks, sheeted vein arrays, breccia veins, dilational jogs, specific vein systems and specific ore systems such as orogenic gold deposits or epithermal deposits, but I won't. I've tried to focus this because Jess said I've got a bit of a time limit. So hopefully some of you people have got more than one beer in front of you. I actually have. So that's a very important take home from this talk, if nothing else. The little figure there on the right-hand side, I've put this in for one of my colleagues who's working on the Buritica deposit in Colombia. Fascinating deposit, very strongly vein hosted, and that in turn relates to the structural architecture of the deposit. And in this one, we can see where a vein has intersected another lithology and the composition has been favourable enough that we've dropped out some sulfides in that. Now, my colleague, Marcelo Trujillo, I said I'd throw something in for him. He wanted me to put in some photos of some boulders, and I said it probably won't suit the talk. So there you go, Marcelo, there's your honourable mention, mate. Most deposits that we look at nowadays have had some component of deformation through them. And it doesn't have to be something like D1, D2, D3, so forth, all the deformation stages. We might just be looking at one cleavage. We might be looking at a fracture array. We might be looking at a couple of fault sets, but they all comprise the structural architecture of the deposit, as do the veins, and we have to get the overprinting information between them. We can't get a snapshot of the evolution of a deposit until we can establish that. And just about any deposit you go to, you will see that there's veins in it, and typically more than one. Go to some place like Mount Isa. The Mount Isa ore bodies have got up to 4 deformation phases through them and copious amounts of veins of different stages. One that I worked on in Northern Ireland, Curragnolt, I looked at that with James Sedorn. There's another shameless name drop. And we concluded there's probably a couple of deformation events there. Sometimes you can go a bit insane. There was a previous worker put 7 different deformation events in there, D1 to D7, which was just crazy. So I will also shamelessly harass people who say the wrong things as well during this talk, and Jess will edit this out later if I go overboard. It's critical to establish the timing of emplacement of these vein sets, because the confident determination of that then actually helps us establish how that formed, and that in turn informs how we put our exploration models together, how we put our resource models together, how we integrate them all to actually understand our mineral systems. Whoops. So what I want to do now is just go through the practicalities of putting together a vein paragenetic overprinting history. And I understand that quite a few people listening to this talk who are still with us, who haven't tuned out, will know a bit of this stuff. But we have to remember that some of this stuff just doesn't get taught nowadays. And when you get out into industry and you're given a drill hole, which has got a lot of different veins in it, you sit back and you think, shit, how the hell do I deal with this? So this is a little bit of a take home on how you can at least get started with that. And this is, the first shot is actually from when I was doing some stuff for Newmont, and this was with Derek Waterfield up in the Duketon belt of the eastern goldfields of Western Australia. And it takes you through some slides from different deposits and the different steps for how to put together a paragenetic overprinting history. So first thing you do, if possible, is lay out as much of your core as possible. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rely dominantly on photographs and examples from drill core, because that's mostly what we work with, particularly if you're in Western Australia when you have very little outcrop. But the same principles apply if your work, sorry, the sun, I don't have a blind on this window and the sun comes in the afternoon. So it gives me that nice halo that is usually dropped. So what we're going to do is we'll go through the steps in this, and just keep in mind that regardless of the style of deposit, whether it's orogenic, porphyry, epithermal, deformed VMS or whatever, the same methods apply. Structure is beautiful like that. You can take it across a number of different environments. So once you've laid it out, you start thinking about, right, how do we get stuck into this? What do we do with it? And the first thing to do is just go through and look at the core and look at all of the different structures in there and try identify things that look interesting. I just pick them up in the tray like that. One of the things I have learned over time as you do this is that you should put depths on your core, because if you're like me, you take a few pieces of core away and you come back and you can't find out where it goes back. And I will be one of the worst offenders in the world for randomizing your ore body if I don't put numbers on the core. So do that, and then start looking at the different styles of the vein sets, the alteration styles and the non-vein structures. And the example I've got at the bottom there is really interesting. Arguably, all of these veins are the same generation, yet if you look at them, they all look remarkably different. So if we go from the left, we've got a pyrrhotite-rich vein with a bit of a diffuse edge. Then we've got a pyrrhotite carbonate vein. Then we've got largely a carbonate vein. Then we've got another pyrrhotite carbonate vein. Then we've got some diffuse alteration or a vein along the lithological layering. And then on the right-hand side, we have actually got a vein that has got some shear lamination up along the margin of it. So we've got all those veins, and then we've got these little ones in between. So you think, oh, geez, are these all different or what? Well, there are some commonalities. There is a common mineralogy. It's typically pyrrhotite and carbonate. There is a common orientation. They're all at a similar angle to the core axis. And if you look at them, pretty well all of them have got some form of pinch and swell. So they've all been affected by some sort of deformation, which has given proto-boudinage to them. So what we have to do is think about how do we document each of these veins such that we can then compare them later on. Because if you just saw one of these veins in isolation in one part of the core and one in another place, you might think, well, two different events or two different vein stages. So, as I said, this is to re-emphasize, put some depths on your core and make sure there's arrows on the back. I went to Tasiast to Mauritania, and they had some beautiful, complete lines of orientation on the core. And when I looked on the core, there'd been no arrows put on it initially, and all the core had been put in the boxes back to front, and then there had been lines put on it. So the orientation lines were going up and down hole within the core. So just check that all your core locks together, guys. It's super important. Next thing is you've got to document each of your vein stages. So this stuff is from the Achim deposit, which is Newmont's deposit in Ghana in West Africa. I was fortunate enough to work on this before they actually started mining it. So this was in the initial stages of drilling, and I went there with my colleague, Julian Stevens, and we went through it and we looked at all the different vein stages. So if we take a look at the top one, what we see is there's a couple of different veins. There's one parallel to a fabric, which I've labelled A. Then we've got a carbonate quartz one, which is weakly folded, and the foliation through here looks to be axial plane. I've labelled that D. So another portion of the deposit, I've still got these A veins here, which are parallel to the foliation, but then I've got these other veins, which I've labelled as C and B. B is interesting because we can see there's two orange veins here which are overlapping, and it looks like this is probably a composite vein made up of a slightly lighter coloured vein and another darker one which is actually breaking in over the top. So this is one of the tricks, recognising when you have two veins together which may be two totally different stages. These are composite veins. So once we've done that, you've got to describe all the veins, and I do it in terms of mineralogy. So what's the vein comprised of? The morphology, what is the shape of it? Crack seal, breccia, laminated, fine-grained, etc. Then the cross-cutting relationships between those different vein types. So does A cross B and B cross D and so forth? Then look at the geometry, like we saw in that previous slide. Is it folded, Boudin, arched, planar, part of a stockwork, so forth? And the orientation. Now here, when I say orientation, I'm not talking about the true orientation when you measure it. What does its orientation look like in the drill core? If your core is oriented and it's intact and all the pieces locked together and it's continuous, then you should be able to see consistent core to vein angles all the way through, where you can say, well, potentially this is all the same vein set, it all has the same look. But then the caveat is it part of a sheeted vein array or part of a stockwork? And you might have two veins of the same age with different orientations. Then look at the alteration. That will vary on different vein types. It might have different mineralogy. It might be diffuse. It might be sharp. It might be wide. It might be narrow, etc. Now, when I do all this, I prefer not to use the assay data when I'm looking at the veins, because the worst thing you can do is have the assay data which tells you which veins are mineralized, and you keep biasing yourself and looking back to those. And if we take the example of, say, quartz carbonate veins, they're the most common veins in the world, and you can go to a deposit where they may actually host gold in one generation but not in another. And if you consider them all part of the same sequence and you just label them all A or B, for example, you can't actually separate those later on. You've got a better chance if you look at it objectively without your grades, because you will start finding the nuances between the differences in the different vein sets. So I prefer to do that. Then once that I've identified all my different vein sets, I then go through with the grades and see which one of those vein sets actually tallies up with my assays. So I tend to put letters on mine. If you start calling them vein 1, 2, 3, 4, what happens is people start thinking vein 1 formed first, vein 2 was second, vein 3 was third, and so forth. I don't care what you call them. I tend to call them A, B, and C, so I don't actually put them in a preferred thing. You can call them Donald, you can call them Trump, you can call them, you know, whatever you like. Probably not Donald Trump. We're trying to erase that at the moment. And I use Chinograph pencils to scribble on stuff, and yes, they leave a mark which is relatively permanent, but one of your best friends in these sort of situations is wet and dry sandpaper. You can sand those labels off if they're not right. And also there might be places where you've got an orientation line, the texture goes under it. You can sand the line off, check the texture and put the line back on. And I tend to polish all the core with wet and dry sandpaper before I photograph it too, because there's nothing worse than oxidized core. You know, you've got oxidized sulfides and so forth. You can't see the grain scale relationships and so forth. I used to say, if you can't see it with a hand lens, then it's not worth seeing. I've actually gotten to the vintage where my hair's grey and I'm giving this talk wearing glasses. So I do use a hand lens now, and that's useless if your core is oxidized. So then I start putting all your different vein stages down, and I'm just doing it in my notebook. So what I've got here is I've got all the different vein stages down the one side. I've then put them in what I think is the chronological order of overprinting, cascading down from left to right. I've then put D1 and D2 because I've got fabrics in the rock which I've associated with those two events, and then I've apportioned the different vein sets to the different deformation events. So in summary, this is what you do. You get your vein descriptions, you characterize your veins in terms of shape, morphology, alteration, etc. You then look at the cross-cutting relationships, so you've got the temporal relationships, and then you put the other structures in there, and then such as your S1s, your S2s, your faults, and so forth, and then apportion it relative to your deformation events. And what you should end up with at the end is a snapshot of your deposit. It should not just be a vein overprinting history. That's just part of your overall geological history. One of the really sad things is we go to uni, the lecturers try and drum into us about geological history, what comes first, second, third, and fourth. They teach us geological timescales and so forth. And then people go out into the workforce and forget it all and just log the things they think are important rather than looking at the cross-cutting relationships. And you can't get a snapshot of your deposit if you don't see how it's evolved over time. And this allows you to do it. So what I do is I put it all together as an Excel spreadsheet. So if some of these events don't work, then I can just take that column out or that row out, and it allows me to shift things around. And what I do is I also color code things. So quartz I typically put in as orange, gold, as you would expect, goes in as yellow. Chlorite typically goes in as green. So I can see mineralogy and overprinting relationships of different structures over time as this deposit's evolved. And what you see here is that the gold and yellow down the bottom is actually associated with reactivation of the footwall fault, which in turn is related with these type B1 veins. So now we know what are the important mineralized veins in the deposit and what it's fitting into in terms of the overall architecture. And it can get as complex as you like. So this one here, this took about 4 days to resolve. And what I do is I break out every single thing. So I even break out the individual sulfides and gold. So I might have arsenic, pyrite and gold, even though they occur as a mineral assemblage inside a vein, which might be quartz carbonate, arsenopyrite, for example. But the reason I do that is there will be some places in the deposit where you have one or the other, and you need to be able to relate that back to the particular vein set to which it belongs. And I've had some people who don't understand why this is broken out in this much detail, and they've suggested that it's not useful. I would argue that point very vociferously, and I would probably even take them out the back and roll them in the gravel to try and, convince them of the importance of getting the overprinting relationships and the age of your mineralization correct. And so we can see within this, the yellow is the age of your gold. We can see that if we track that up, that it's related to these events here, which in turn are related over here to these particular vein sets. So what you can see is there's probably about 4 vein and breccia sets which are related to gold. So we can collapse this down and simplify it now. If we don't split things out at the start, you will end up with a heap of data you can't split out later on. You can always combine it if you've broken it up in the first place, but you can never split it back out. I had one clown tell me once when I looked at all his data and said, look, all of your data is rotated. And on this stereo, I said, look, on the stereo net, everything is rotating about your core axis and forming a small circle. And he said to me, well, just use the good stuff. And I said, you don't understand. You cannot tell which stuff is good. And that's when you start amalgamating your data, it is the same thing. Anyway, I'm not going to mention his name. I'll probably get thrown off if I do that. So what we do then, and what I've done here is I've actually cut the heads off one of my assistants to protect the innocent or the guilty, whatever she was. I won't mention Michaela's name or the other lass who helped me. Beck, thank you very much, guys. That was spectacularly good work that you helped me with. In the space of a couple of weeks, we collected something like 2,200 measurements from just using a core orienting frame. And you might say, why didn't you use an IQ logger? Why didn't you use an alpha beta thing? Why didn't you use a chronometer? Well, the reason being is this core had already been cut and assayed. It's very hard to use some of those alpha beta devices with half core. You really do need to measure it. And once you've got a flat surface where you can put a straight line on what you're measuring, you can actually measure half core very efficiently within a core orienting frame. The other problem you have with a lot of those alpha beta things is you bias your data sets. This is a total digression. I do this a lot. You will find that you will have low alpha angles where structures cut along the core axis, and it's almost impossible to measure them with an alpha beta device. So you end up having to go and use a core orienting frame and a structural compass. So for people who aren't using one of those, sadly, I think you guys are probably stuffing up some of your data. And so these people who make spectacularly good models like Jun Cowan, another shameless name drop, they cannot produce their spectacular models correctly if they don't get spectacularly good data. And you won't get that if you don't use the alpha beta things in combination with the rocket launchers or core orienting frames. For people who don't know what a rocket launcher is, I've got to be careful now given what's going on in Israel. Right, moving on to the next thing. So the different populations, measure them as individual populations. If you've got 2 quartz carbonate vein sets, don't combine them, measure them as 2 different ones so you can compare their orientations as populations. One might be mineralized, one might not be. Just as an aside, this was all taken outside, well away from any magnetic influence before we measured this stuff up. And you can see there, my colleague Michaela has put all of this stuff in order depth-wise. So we're measuring it all up from up on top of the hole as we go down the hole, and we take over whole arm loads in these buckets and measure up, 50 pieces at a time. So it's a real assembly line once we've identified what we have to measure. And this is another reason why you put depths on your core, because otherwise you will be walking backwards and forwards for the rest of the day deciding where it goes back. So some of the issues, composite veins, we've seen an example of one of them already, and I'll show you some more now, but commonly what you'll see is a presence of two different minerals that have different formation conditions, maybe green schist versus amphibolite. You might get an asymmetric distribution of the vein minerals, an asymmetric distribution of the alteration around the veins, and cross-cutting relationships as you go along the veins, along their strike or up and down dip. The other thing is changes in vein character and composition. And these are really intriguing. Some things you can explain, others are just bloody maddening, and you just have to appreciate that some of these vein systems can be very complex. So composite veins, this is an example from the Chattree deposit, which I was lucky enough to have a look at some years back. And this vein here is, this grey vein is a quartz vein, which is a host to a lormentite vein, which just progressively cuts backwards and forwards through this vein. And then one of its sister veins of the same set is out here all by itself. So it's actually using a pre-existing weakness in this vein to emplace along it. Two totally different vein sets, different ages, but in one case, they're combining to form a composite structure. So you have to work out your paragenesis, your overprinting history, combine it with all of the other aspects, such as the igneous petrology, look at your petrologic relationships and so forth, to try and tease apart these relationships, which can otherwise be quite problematic. In this one here, this is pretty explanatory. Actually, I forgot to mention that as a bit of an aside with that job in Chattree, it was really interesting. They stuck me in a hotel out in the country all by myself. It was about five floors, and I was the only one in there. And I used to turn up for dinner at night, and there's three women of different ages, I think they were daughter, mother and grandmother, used to just sing at me while I tried to have lunch by myself in this huge restaurant. And they used to always place me right up near the stage, and I just didn't know where to look. And till I finally realised they came on at 6 o'clock, and I said to the guys at the mine, I'm happy to start at dawn so long as I finish dinner before these people start singing at me. And the other beautiful thing was I was in bed one night, and I thought, geez, something's biting me. And I turned the lights on, and there was a hole in the wall, and there was a nest of ants pouring out, and they'd half devoured me during the night. So, well, welcome to geology in Thailand. So this vein here, this is from the Quartus deposit, which is north of Kalgoorlie in the Eastern Goldfields. A spectacularly good geologist there, Michelle Coots. I was working with her, and this is one of the things that we looked at. And you can see there's an older vein there, which is the widest part of the vein. And inside, there's actually a fibrous one cutting backwards and forwards across it. So it's a composite vein of two separate veins. And these examples here, so this is from the Namoya Twangiza gold belt, which is just inboard of Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Spectacularly endowed belt, pretty well totally undeveloped, bar the 4 mines or prospects along it. So you're flying over virgin rainforest, gorillas in the mist type territory when you're looking at this stuff. And I think it's one of the last semi-accessible great big gold belts in the world, because when I looked at the amount of artisanal working, I looked at the geology of the deposits and that, it reminded me of Kibale up in the northeast Congo. I was in there many years before Randgold and Anglo Gold and those guys got in there, and it just reminded me of exactly the same thing, bar in this case I didn't get chased by a village of people wielding machetes, whereas I did in the first case, and luckily I could run faster back then. In this case, I actually left because a local warlord invaded one of the mines and armed the locals, and then they kidnapped 2 of my colleagues, and then the Ebola virus started. So I thought, this is a bit of a perfect storm, it might be time to leave. So regardless, spectacular geology. On the left-hand side there, you can see one of the composite veins. It's the vein on the left-hand side. So we can see a quartz vein coming down here. There is a little bit of fracturing going across it. and there is a bit of thickness in change in thickness. Same with this one here. You can see there's a bit of a change in thickness. So these have had a slight bit of boudinage or pinch and swell. And you can see there's another vein of different mineralogy going up against the side of this vein, and then they separate. So this is a composite vein comprising two very identifiable different veins. However, if you go to this one from Twongiza, what you see here is you see these carbonate veins coming up at an angle, and then they're cut by these narrower veins coming this way. And the pyrite in these thicker veins is actually a function of these later veins. What's happened is they've come through, they've cross-cut these, and they've mineralized preferentially the older vein set. So this mineralogy in here is actually due to this other vein coming through here. So these are one of these tricks that you have to be aware of, and where you have to tease apart the different vein generations. In this one at the bottom, you can see there's two different veins. There's one coming along here. It steps across and then goes along the bottom of the vein. Interestingly, if you look at the alteration selvage, it's about the same thickness on either side. So what that suggests is that the alteration is due to the older vein, because if the alteration was due to the younger vein, the older vein may have acted as a barrier to the fluids, and you might only get the alteration selvage on one side. These are some pretty easy to recognise examples. The one on the left-hand side, we've got a fibrous epidote vein up against a quartz chlorite vein, but they're following the same orientation, and it all makes sense. If you've got a pre-existing structure in the rock, it's a favourable orientation for emplacing a vein. Subsequent vein sets are just going to exploit that. So, you know, this is to be expected. This one here, we've got a shear vein against a fibrous vein. And the top one, two totally different style veins. This one's a bit of a different colour. It's a little bit more oxidised. This one here is actually comprised of two veins as well. So we've actually got a composite vein of at least 3 episodes here. In this one on the top right, this is from the Kintsevere copper deposit in the DRC. And what you see here is you've got a composite vein of chalcopyrite against carbonate. And as we go along the vein, you can see they separate. So they are two separate vein entities. In this bottom one here, you can see there's a slight colour difference between the two quartz veins, but the alteration is only developed on one side. So the alteration is probably associated with this white vein on the bottom side, and the alteration fluids could not actually get across onto the other side of the other vein. So we've got a composite vein with alteration restricted to one side. This is another obvious one. We've got an upper vein here, which is a breccia vein. Then we've got a shear vein below it. And then we've got a third vein that's gone along the shear vein and cut across both of them. So we've got composite vein formation here of at least 3 veins. So we're getting close, guys. So, you know, don't scull your beer if it's your last one, or open a new one, because this is going to get really exciting. Right. Round of applause there. So the other thing is we have to be aware of changes in composition, and veins will change composition over very short distances. And when you think about it, when we're looking at a lot of these things, we're looking at them in drill core. And so we've only got a few centimetres of exposure through a vein, and yet they can be changing markedly just out of section. So if we consider this one here on the right-hand side, which is a picture taken underground at the Partavara orogenic gold deposit in Finland, worked on that with Julian Barnes, another shameless name drop, a spectacularly smart guy. He's got a brain the size of a planet. And what you see here are veins which are comprised of amphibole coming down into veins that are comprised of carbonate. And you can see there's a change from a greeny grey to a white where this happens. So we've got it occurring in 3 different places here. If we were unfortunate enough to stick a drill hole through this, as I've tried to show over on the left-hand side, what that would look like is we're going through amphibole, carbonate, carbonate, amphibole, carbonate. So we might think they're 2 separate vein stages, when in fact, they're all part of the same vein stockwork. Now, they may be different ages of emplacement of the different minerals, but they're still part of that vein system. In this example here, what we see is a quartz vein, and that quartz vein has gotten progressively more fractured as we go down, and those fractures have filled up with actinolite to the point where at the bottom of the vein, they're completely choked, and it's basically an actinolite vein. It's not a quartz vein, but it's all the same vein. If we consider 2 drill holes through this, one might intersect a quartz vein, one might intersect an actinolite vein, and you think, well, they're 2 different entities, we won't join them up, we won't correlate them. that would be a bit of a mistake because this is all part of the mineralising assemblage at part of Ara. Another example here, we can see a quartz carbonate vein. Like I said, quartz carbonate veins, they are the, what's a good analogy? They're the blowflies of the vein world. They are everywhere. I was going to say something that Jess would have had to edit out, but I didn't. What we see here is we can see white carbonate and quartz. Then it changes, it transforms into quartz with a sort of grey, brown, khaki carbonate, and then it becomes a grey vein. And this is all happening along the strike of the same vein. What you also notice is that the alteration assemblage is largely associated with the first two colour changes. There's not so much alteration associated with the grey stuff on the left-hand side. In these, it's a bit easier to interpret the change in vein composition. You can see as this vein traverses different layers of composition, it actually changes its mineralogy. So up in here, we've got biotite, actinolite. We come through and we're getting carbonate and quartz through this central lens, and then we're coming out and then we're starting to pick up some more biotite again, and then we even change the thickness of the vein. In the one below, we see we totally choke the vein with actinolite as it goes across this layer here, and then when we get out into these whiter layers either side, we go back to more carbonate dominated. So what it's suggesting is that these veins are not just transporters of fluid where you have fluids emanating from the veins into the wall rock. Once you establish some sort of fluid connectivity between the wall rock and the veins, you're moving stuff backwards and forwards. So you're actually changing composition of the veins as well as the wall rock. And this example here, so what we've got is this dull grey vein starting on the right-hand side, coming across a little bit of pink material, grey again, and then becomes pink again. So we're transforming from a dull grey carbonate through to a manganocarbonate. And what we see happening is that we've got another stage of veins coming in, very narrow, and where they intersect these veins, they change the composition. So go back to this little bit here on the right, here's one of these veins again, come through, it's intersected, and there's our manganocarbonate. So seeing the change in colour along this structure, we can now explain it as due to the interaction of two different veins of two different ages, rather than a change in composition during deposition of one vein. This is a really intriguing one. Steve Micklethwaite will probably have ideas on this, but what we see is we've got a bit of actinolite. We then go into a white carbonate vein, and then we've got hematite alteration. There is a bit of displacement, so we can see here, this contact here is up here. Then over on this side, we've got another vein coming along, and as it changes orientation, it actually transforms to a differentiated crenulation cleavage. And as the informed would know and the uninformed would argue, we do get fluid flow along these differentiation zones and these differentiated crenulation cleavages. So there is some fluid interchange, which is actually sourcing fluids or giving fluids to this vein as it's forming in this particular layer. So you've got to be careful when you look at the mineralogy of these things. You must also look at what's happening to the adjacent structures and see, in this case, it just trams across them, and these it transforms into them. So they're probably two different vein stages. In this one here, what we can see is we've got a compositional boundary coming through here. As the vein exits from this one, we go from a vein that has got quartz in the core of it, and we've got actinolite on the margins, and then we've got pyrite and pyrrhotite inside. As we go out into the next layer, we've got nothing inside the veins, and the pyrrhotite then becomes part of the vein selvage. So we've actually transformed how the vein looks quite markedly as we've gone from one layer to the next. Okay, so we're almost there, guys. Only a couple of slides to go. This is another one that most people would know about. This is from an orogenic gold deposit. This is from a Ahafo, the monster deposit in West Africa that Newmont owns. And what we see is, as we're closer to the fluid source, we've got these little veinlets coming through. And these veinlets have got alteration around them. We've got sericite silica. We've got a bit of chloride out here. And as we go away from the fluid source, we've still got the little silica veinlets, but we're changing the nature of the alteration. So now we can see there's more chlorite, and we're starting to get epidote in the wall rocks. And then as we go even further out, we've still got the little silica veinlets, but now the wall rock alteration is purely chlorite, and then we've got epidote adjacent to that. So these veins, when you look at them in their alteration selvages, they all look fundamentally different, yet they're all the same vein set, and they're all part of the mineralizing assemblage. Interestingly, when this was being put together, I had a few issues with the core orientations, and I went down to the drill office, and there was a local geologist, and I won't mention his name, and we had a roaring argument to the point where he slammed a door in my face, and 5 minutes later he got the Canadian drilling foreman to come down and try and teach me a lesson, at which point I said, just come with me, and before we start having a dust up, let's just have a look at the state of the core. And the guy looked at it and said, you're right, that's totally inexcusable, I apologise. The local geologist never spoke to me again, and he's apparently somewhere in business development now, so you can fail and then succeed phenomenally, apparently. But the other interesting thing was, once we rectified all the core orientations and looked at the first set of resource sections, the deposit was going to be modelled up with vertical ore bodies, and when we looked at how they joined together, they were sub-horizontal. So there was a little bit of a problem there, and which would have been another reason he didn't want to talk to me, I guess. Anyway, privately we can mention names, maybe. So on this vein on the other side, you can see going up across the core, we've got this white quartz vein. Inside, we've got this white sort of chalcedonic mineralisation infilling, but then you see it breaks out across it. So we really don't know the age span between these two different vein mineral stages, the white versus the cream coloured stuff. We just know that this one cross-cuts that one. So they might be very closely spaced in time, or it might be very markedly different in time. So a summary of a few comments. A vein system analysis is relatively expensive, but it's valuable. So, you know, we're the guys, we're the rank and file who are out there, you know, stamping around. We're looking at the drill core. We're the guys that see it comes out of the ground first. We're the ones getting dirty underground. I would consider myself a field geologist who likes going underground and going to site and going stamping around the bush. I'm not somebody who's going to sit in the office and spin around 3D models without actually seeing the mineralisation. And most of the people, when they start a career in geology, they're the guys out looking at this stuff, and they should be applying it because it doesn't cost anything, okay? When I look at people logging holes, they have substantial amounts of core on the racks, and commonly they don't understand it. And you think, well, why not? You have got a lot of core out here. Take a couple of hours off and walk along it and understand it. It is not wasting time, and it is not academic, and it's not, you know, wasting money. It's vein system analysis. It's not to be done in isolation. It's one of those things that you have to incorporate into the overall geological history of the deposit. You have to incorporate your geochemistry. You have to incorporate your igneous petrology. You have to incorporate metamorphism, alteration, all of those other things. Do not do it in isolation. I have some people who have made comments that have said, we don't want the structure to complicate the geology of a deposit. This isn't complicating it. It's helping you understand it and mine it and be smart about it. Vein systems can be complex, but if you systematically document them and use the process I showed earlier, you know, put in your own perturbations on how you do it, but do it systematically, you will resolve it. And you have to do it in each new drill hole, do it at each new ore body or each mine, because fluid systems change over short distances. Sometimes they can be very widespread, but what we're doing is we're trying to establish histories that we can then compare. And then if we find commonality, we have geological timelines where we can compare different vein sets, different structures from deposit to deposit. The morphology, the mineralogy, and the orientation can change markedly within individual vein populations. And in all of these studies, one of your best friends is wet and dry sandpaper. So that allows you to polish the core off, get rid of oxidation, see textures, remove, you know, manic scribblings. You know, you'll get some wild-eyed, you know, high-powered, very high-charging consultant will come in and he'll draw pictures with arrows all over your core. And at the end, you think, what the hell was that? But then you've defaced all the textures. So get your wet and dry out and get rid of all that stuff. At the end of the day, we need to give veins the attention they deserve on the deposits we're working on, and we also need to give our colleagues credit, take ownership. Don't take ownership of other people's work, as I had one consultant do in recent years where he rebadged one of my reports, and I am still very cranky over that one. Wear sunscreen. It's important, guys. You only get one set of skin. Be kind to animals, because you should. You should. enjoy a cold beer, which I'm doing now, and just be nice, you know? That's some of the important take home. So emphasising vein system analysis is a very good weapon for helping you understand your deposit. The end.